As primary season winds down, the Republican task of giving moderate makeovers to all of the people who are extreme enough to have won Republican primaries this year is a tall order. The Republicans are faced with the challenge of trying to seriously make over a lot of seriously conservative candidates. I do not envy anyone that job. But in one particular instance, not only is the makeover going to be difficult, Republicans have already tipped their hand that they don't really want to do it. In the Florida governor's race, the man who won the primary, Rick Scott, is not only not the establishment pick, he sort of got into a fight with the Republican Governors Association during the primary. The RGA chairman, Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour, publicly accused Rick Scott of distorting the facts in a political ad. Governor Barbour told Rick Scott to pull that ad and to move forward in the primary in a constructive manner. Mr. Scott declined. Meow. But Rick Scott winning the Florida primary isn't just awkward for the Republican powers that be because of his bad relationship with the Republican powers that be. Rick Scott winning the Florida primary and becoming the Republican Party's nominee for governor in that state is also a bit of a microcosm, a nutshell, a you can't make this stuff up example of what's going on in Republican politics for this year's elections. Rick Scott's main claim to fame politically is on the issue of health care. Whatever you think about health reform, essentially, it was a project to expand the number of people in the country with health insurance, right? Rick Scott did all he could to lead the opposition to health reform. He even took credit for killing the public option. His group, Conservatives for Patients' Rights, helped organize those Go Scream at Your Congressman events during the hot, shouty town hall meetings last August. Remember those? To be clear about what this means, Rick Scott organized opposition to more people getting health insurance while he was running a chain of for-profit walk-in clinics that depend for their profitability on people not having health insurance. It's a chain of for-profit health clinics, many located inside Walmarts, that largely serve the uninsured. In other words, Rick Scott makes money off of people not having insurance, and so Rick Scott organized a political movement to keep people from getting insurance so they could go to real doctors' offices. But that's not even the most incredible thing about Rick Scott. Before Rick Scott founded his chain of for-profit health clinics that depend on people not having insurance in order to make money, what was he famous for? He was famous for incurring the largest Medicare fraud fine ever. He headed up a healthcare company that systematically defrauded the government on Medicare charges. In other words, stole money to the point where the fine was $1.7 billion. The biggest ever. The fine for what happened at Columbia HCA under Rick Scott's leadership was $1.7 billion. Amid that scandal, he was quietly pushed out by the board of directors of the company and given a nearly $10 million golden parachute, leaving the company holding the bag for the fraud charges and leaving Rick Scott's own reputation apparently to be a great springboard to higher office. Rick Scott was not exactly expected to win this gubernatorial primary in Florida. He was behind in most of the polls heading into yesterday's race, but he won. So, congratulations, Florida Republicans. You did it. You really did. Joining us now is Nate Silver of the 538 blog. Nate, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
I have to tell you congratulations for 538 and moving over to the New York Times website. It's great.
Yeah, it's some really cool visual displays of the information, and it's, a ton of work the last week or so for everyone to get it together, but it's really cool. You should go check it out.
It's totally worth checking out, and I will say that traffic will follow wherever you go, but it is a credit to them that they stole you. So I
hope so.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Polling-wise, Rick Scott was down in two of the major polls heading into the election, but he was up in one of them. He was up in public policy polling. They had him up 7 points going into the primary. From a polling standpoint, a statistical standpoint, do you see the Scott victory as a surprise?
Not really. If you look at what happens in these polls of gubernatorial and senatorial primaries, the average poll has been off by 10 points, right? That's not even the margin of error. That's the average miss is 10 points. So basically, if you're anywhere within single digits, either candidate can win, and you're not learning very much. And especially when you have three polls that diverge so much, they're all pretty good pollsters, actually. People are having a real trouble honing in on which person cares enough, which type of person cares enough to go vote in a Republican primary this year. You know, when public policy polling said it's not necessarily the 2004 kind of conservative voters, it's more kind of people who are kind of maybe Perot voters coming out of the woodwork, and people who are not traditional likely voters, people who are motivated by the Tea Party or by Obamacare or by all these kind of new and fresh concerns that are happening this year.
So polling is really off for the primaries this year. You said average by 10 points, and you think that's mostly because of sampling, because people are when pollsters are trying to figure out whether or not people's preferences translate into election outcomes, they're not asking the right people.
Sure, it's hard to figure out if someone's going to vote or not than who they'll vote for a lot of the time, right? I mean, basically, you know, people don't lie about who they vote for, but a lot of people say they're going to go and vote like when they don't. So people say they're going to go to yoga class and they don't, you know. And so pollsters basically take educated guesses at what so-called likely voters are, but it's really kind of a, you know, it's more an art than a science when only maybe 10 or 20% of the people in a state might turn out in a primary. And if you get the wrong 10 or 20%, it might be a totally different segment of the electorate. And that's what you had happening here, is you had three pretty smart pollsters making different guesses about who the voters would be, and public policy polling did well and got it right. But it's not that surprising, I don't think, to see these polls be that far off. You shouldn't think about general election polls where they're usually within 3 or 4 points to apply to primaries, especially kind of a gubernatorial or a Senate primary. Presidential primaries are bad enough. So you just wouldn't
expect them to be that accurate. So it's not, even though they've been bad.
Anywhere within the vicinity of making it close, and anything can happen. Absolutely.
So how about looking up at the Miller-Murkowski race in Alaska? I mean, very recently Murkowski was up by very dramatic margins in those polls, like 20, 30 points, and now it's close enough that we can't call it, and it looks like it's leaning toward Joe Miller.
Yeah, I mean, but let's be careful what we mean by very recently. So the last poll came out about 6 weeks ago, and in a primary, when people don't even know who the candidates are often until a week before the election, in that poll that came out where she had a 30-point lead, half people didn't know who Miller was, right? In some ways that he had 30% support with only 50% name recognition is actually fairly auspicious in certain ways. It said that, hey, people like him once they get to know him. And so, you know, again, if we had that poll or that race polled every week, we might have had him within 5 points or 10 points, or some polls might have had him ahead. But to have one 6-week-old poll basically just means that we don't really know anything from what the polling tells us. And when you have a candidate who has $500,000 going in to the race from the Tea Party Express in a market like Alaska, we can buy a whole TV station for $500,000 practically, and he's kind of marketed as a likable kind of lumberjack, kind of everyman guy. I think they ran a pretty good, smart television campaign. It's not that shocking, really. You know, it's not the outcome you would have expected yesterday morning, but you know, Scott Brown was 30 points down, you know, 6 weeks to go into the election.
Briefly, Nate, on the issue of turnout, are we getting turnout figures from the primary season so far that's politically significant in terms of predicting stuff for November?
You never know. It depends kind of on the particular contingencies. But, you know, Marco Rubio was the first ever primary candidate in Florida for Senate to get more than 1 million votes, and he didn't really have much opposition. So clearly, I think there's more enthusiasm on the GOP side. But also the races tend to be more competitive. I mean, you know, anytime a party is kind of on the rise, right, people want in, and that's why you have candidates like Rick Scott, I suppose, who think, you know, why not? This is kind of, if I'm ever going to get elected, it's going to be a year like this one. And you do see that, by the way, where you have years like 2006, like 1994, when you have kind of wave years, you sometimes get people elected who, you know, otherwise wouldn't, and they go out in the next wave. That's one reason why there are waves, is because you have people who don't really, you know, meet the definition of a great candidate, but who get caught up in the storm, and some of them adapt and some of them don't.
Nate Silver of 538, the 538 blog at NewYorkTimes.com. That's the way to say it?
Absolutely.
All right. Nate, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel.
Appreciate it.